Skeuomorphic design is nothing new. Huge in the Steve Jobs era at Apple, it was the art of designing user interfaces, buttons, and icons with more realistic characteristics. This became a popular way to display icons and graphics because it was very intuitive and user-friendly. We can see this in the Instagram logo. The older one had texture, details, lighting, and more to give us this organic feeling. Then a few years ago, and really in the last decade, we had a huge shift away from skeuomorphic into flat design. As we know, flat design has been all the rage with simple single-tone shadows, no blurring, and an overall reduction of details on objects to give them a more simple presentation. A shift to flat design happened because user interfaces became smaller and smaller, and having a simple icon to display an action or button was necessary. As in all things design, the pendulum always swings back the other way. We're oversaturated with flat design. It's clean, easy to use for sure, but there seems to be an overall lack of character with flat design. If everyone is doing it, does it become ordinary, dull, useful for sure, and sometimes breathtaking in its simplicity? But humans have never been a group to stay still for too long. Modern skeuomorphism, or neumorphism as some may call it, it's not just what it was 10 years ago, but it's an evolution in how people use this design idea. Gone are the heavy uses of textures and highlights, and now comes the use of lots of subtle shadows and highlights, blurred, to create this incredible layered look. This look feels as though you could touch it and feel the ridges of the glass and aluminum and plastic on your fingers. We love to go into the store and just touch things. We're tactile creatures, and to have a design trend that gives us the feeling that the digital world can feel real through the use of design is incredible. We can emulate curves through cleverly placed highlights and shadows. The digital world feels alive again and organic. So how can I practice or emulate this neumorphic or skeuomorphic design theme? It's more simple to create this effect than you realize, as it's a balance of placing highlights, a lighter color, and shadows, a darker color, in strategic places. You can create this effect using a wide variety of software, including Affinity Designer, Adobe Photoshop, but today I'm going to show you how to do a quick little project using Adobe Illustrator to create a quick skeuomorphic design button. So today we're going to get a chance to practice this very new design trend that you're seeing everywhere, but it's a little bit more simple than you think. It looks like it's a pretty complex effect, but it's really just a highlight layer, a shadow layer, and some simple flat shapes to create this effect. And I have this as a downloadable file so you can work alongside with me for this very quick 5-minute project. We have some simple colors we can borrow right here. I'm just going to hold down Option, drag them down so we can recreate everything ourselves. So we're going to be creating this off state button, so a button that hasn't been pressed yet. It's kind of in the off state. We're going to create a simple rounded rectangle. Hold down Shift. Very simple rounded rectangle. And the key to skeuomorphic design is the color on the inside of a shape is going to be the same color as the background. So we're going to take our eyedropper tool and sample our background color. And right now you can't see it, but that's okay because we're going to be adding our highlights and shadows so you'll be able to see it almost pop off the screen. So we're going to duplicate our shape and we're going to create our shadow first. So what we want to do is usually double click and just find one shade darker. So just move down on your color panel to find one shade darker, or already have kind of a color selected for that, just a little bit darker color. Now we're going to send this backwards into the layering system, so Command left bracket, and we're going to position it off a little bit. So instead of being right here, it's going to cast the shadow to the bottom right. So now what we want to do is create the highlight layer. So we're just going to do the same thing. And we're going to make this white, which is going to be brighter than the background. So this is going to be our highlight, and it's going to be to the upper left. We're going to send this backwards to the layering system and shift it up. And we don't want to do a lot of shifting. What we want to do is make it pretty tight about this area. So just have a highlight and a shadow layer. So what we're going to do to create the effect is we need to blur this pretty dramatically. So we're going to select the highlight and the shadow layer and we're going to blur those two shapes behind our main shape. We're going to do this by going to Effect, Blur, and we're just going to do a Gaussian blur. We're going to click on Preview to make sure we have it on the right levels. And let's try about 30 pixels. So now all of a sudden it looks like it's popping off the page. We can of course take our highlights and shadow layers. We could tuck them in tighter if we need to. Because you can see how the effect is already starting to come into place, and it's just 3 simple squares. A highlight square, a shadow square, and the same color square in the center of that's the background. Let's add in our simple icon for the button. I have this icon I did with an icon set we designed in the Digital Design Masterclass. I'm going to borrow it right here and place it into the icon. So how do we make this icon feel a part of this button? Like there's almost a gloss on top of the button, like a glass. We can go ahead and make it a gradient to kind of give it the sense of highlights and shadows, just like we did with the button. So I have a gradient already created here. We're going to do a little bit of a darker color because we want the icon to still stand apart in front of the background. So I'm just going to adapt this gradient, get our gradient tool, and have it be the highlights on the top and shadows on the bottom. So now it looks like it's a part of the button because it's adapting the highlights on the upper left and the shadows of the bottom right. We can add even more complexities to this icon by duplicating it, making it all an even darker color to emulate a shadow. Let's try this darkest color right here. And what we're going to do is just basically add an inner shadow here. We can take our icon, put it right on top, and I'm just going to take my down and left arrow keys and just slightly nudge it over. So now what we're going to do is we're going to grab the layer behind it and the layer in front of it, and we're going to just duplicate this and bring it down here. We're going to basically cut out these shapes to leave just what we want as kind of the inner drop shadow. So we're going to get our shape builder tool right over here, and we're going to click on the option key for subtraction, and we're just carving a little bit of this out. So we're just left with what would be kind of an inner shadow. So we're going to bring this on top of our layer. We no longer need that top layer, we just need the layer we created with the gradient. We're going to bring it on top, right over top, and make it that darker color. And that will be our inner shadow. Just gives it a little more depth and dimension. It's really a small detail. You don't necessarily have to add or do this part. Adds a little bit of a drop shadow, so when you zoom out, it adds a little bit of depth and dimension. There's just one more thing we need to add, and right now it looks great, but there needs to be some kind of highlight or border, a very thin border around the edge to add just a tiny bit more detail, because this isn't just a flat icon. It has plastic, it's got glass on it. We need to have a little bit on the edges to show highlights and shadows. So we're just going to duplicate the square we already have, and we're going to make it a gradient, a very light gradient. So we're going to use this gradient swatch right here. We're going to change the direction on this so we have highlights on the top and shadows on the bottom. And we're just going to flip it to a stroke, and we're going to make it pretty thin and have it be a border right on the outside. Just like that, we added a little bit more dimension with the highlights and the shadows by adding that very thin border. So let's see what the stroke is on this. Just going to our stroke panel, we can even reduce that to make it an even skinnier stroke. And voila, we have our little button. So this is our off state button, and we just need to create our on button. So this is the on state button where the person presses that on the mobile app or wherever they're going to be having this button available to them. So now we need to emulate what it's like to press this button into and past the background. This pressing in, it's going to go down a little bit. So one of the big things we're going to do is switch the highlights and shadows. So instead of the shadow being in the bottom right, it's now going to be inside and in the upper left. Same thing with highlights. Highlights are on the upper right here, this little highlight layer that we created in the very beginning. Right up there on the top, it's now on the inside and also on the bottom right. So the highlights and shadows not only switch, but they become now inside of the button to give a field of depth or a sense of depth, like the button is going downward. So we're just going to copy our existing button, and we're just going to kind of flip some things around here. So we're going to take our highlight and shadow layers off, and let's first bring in our shadow on the upper right. So we're going to need to change the shape of this. We're going to need to reduce the Gaussian blur here. So we could do this by going to our appearance panel, going down, just changing our Gaussian blur that we have on here, just reducing a little bit, maybe 15. And we're going to duplicate it. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the shape builder tool to carve out what we think would be a good shadow. So what we're doing is we're carving out a shadow that's basically going to take on this shape. Let's take both of these, tighten that up a little bit. We're going to select both of these and go to our shape builder tool, and we're just going to punch this out, holding down the option key and punching that out. So we're left with just this shape of a shadow. We're going to bring it right here on the inside of the button. Make sure it's showing up on the top layer. And we're going to do the same thing. We already have this shape created, so let's just copy and paste this, and I'm going to show you a cool trick. So I'm going to hold down the Shift button, go up to our directional controls, and now that I have the Shift button held, it'll automatically do it in 45-degree increments. So I'm just going to transform this to the opposite corner, just like that. And we can go ahead and make this white. I guess we don't need to have this shape anymore. We already just kind of duplicated that. That's going to exist on the inside as well. I'm going to send that backwards and have the shadow be dominant and be on the top. Right about there. So now our button already looks like it's pressing inward. We have one more step to make it really feel like it's being pressed inward. We need to make the stroke on this outside stroke layer a little bit thicker. So instead of a weight being a 0.75 pixels or points, we're going to change that and make it just a tiny bit thicker to kind of give more depth. And something we're going to do to even add just a little more realism is we were going to add a rolled border to the outside border. So what that means is you see right here how it almost looks rolled because it has kind of a shadow on the left and then it has kind of a highlight on the right. So it almost gives an effect of this rolled shaped border. It's not just a flat border, it's rolled. So we're going to do that by creating duplicating this stroke and making it darker. So let's make this stroke a little bit of a darker color, but not super dark, right here. And just make sure that's a stroke. And one thing we're going to do is we're going to do a Gaussian blur on here. We're going to make sure this is on the outside, right about here. And what we're going to do is we're going to just do a Gaussian blur here because right now that's really sharp. So we're going to go up and maybe even make this pretty skinny, 0.5. And go up to Effect, go down to Blur, and let's do a Gaussian blur. We don't want it to be very dramatic. We want it to be just a little blurred. And click OK, so it gives us kind of this rolled border look. And we might need to reduce that a little bit more. And let's lighten that color up just a little bit. A little bit lower contrast. So there we go. So now it looks like it's a little bit more rolled, a little bit more pressed inward. So that is our on state and this is our off state. So we just recreated that step by step. This is the one I created before the class. This is the one we just did. Not a huge difference. That's a good thing. And you can do the same thing with longer buttons. So this is using the same exact method. So we have the highlight on the top left, and we have a shadow on the bottom right, and we have this color that's the same color as the background is. You could do this with any shade. So even if you had a dark UI, you could do it with dark colors. You just have to, and I even have a color palette in the downloadable resource where you can check that out. So you could do this with anything as long as you follow the same basic steps. You could do this with any color and any shade.